At the dawn of the 20th century, the land we now call Tanzania was under the iron grip of the German Empire. Stretching from the Indian Ocean coast to the Great Lakes, German East Africa was a vast territory, rich in fertile land and valuable resources. For the European colonists, it was a treasure trove to be exploited. For the people who had lived there for centuries, it became a land of oppression and suffering. Germany had arrived late to the colonial scramble, but once established, it sought to impose its authority quickly and decisively. The German administration, guided by a philosophy of strict control, introduced harsh taxation, forced labor, and compulsory cultivation of cash crops. Cotton, in particular, became the lifeblood of the colonial economy. Farmers were ordered to dedicate large portions of their arable land to cotton production, often at the expense of their own food crops. Failure to comply invited brutal punishment, whippings, imprisonment, or destruction of homes. Food shortages became common as fertile land was commandeered for cotton. Traditional social structures were disrupted. Festivals, rituals, and the communal way of life began to fray under the weight of exploitation. Many families were forced to send men and even women to work on colonial projects or serve in distant towns. The people were alive, yet their freedom, their land, and their dignity were steadily eroded. By 1905, resentment had simmered for years. Stories of hardship and cruelty traveled across villages and tribes. Farmers whispered of unfair taxation, of crops taken without compensation, of laborers beaten or killed when quotas were not met. Chiefs who tried to resist the demands of the German authorities found themselves replaced, exiled, or executed. Fear and anger coexisted, but beneath it all, a growing yearning for freedom took root. It was in this environment of oppression and desperation that the seeds of rebellion were sown. Ordinary farmers, fishermen, and villagers, people who had never wielded weapons in anger, began to envision the impossible, a revolt against the might of the German Empire. They were inspired by a mix of anger, hope, and faith. Among them emerged voices that would soon ignite a fire across the land. Local prophets, spiritual leaders, and Kinjekitile Ngwale, a man believed to possess mystical powers, began to speak of a future where the German overlords would be defeated. These leaders promised not only freedom but also divine protection, a sacred water, or Maji, that would shield warriors from bullets. This faith, rooted in centuries of African spiritual traditions, became the cornerstone of the coming rebellion. But before the rebellion could ignite, it was essential to understand the sheer scale of German control. The colony was divided into administrative regions, each governed by a German officer and enforced by armed askaris. The roads, rivers, and forests were monitored. Communication lines allowed the Germans to respond rapidly to threats. To rebel against such a structured and well-armed empire seemed impossible. Yet, impossibility has never deterred the human spirit. The rebellion was not merely a spontaneous outbreak of anger. It was a response to decades of exploitation, an assertion of dignity, and a collective cry for freedom. Farmers who had tilled the soil under duress, women who had seen their families torn apart, and elders who remembered life before German rule, all contributed to the growing wave of defiance. Every village that whispered about revolt carried with it a story of injustice, a family punished for failing to meet cotton quotas, a child orphaned by colonial violence, a chief deposed for resisting taxation. These personal tragedies coalesced into a shared vision of rebellion, fueled by the mystical promise of Maji and the belief that united tribes could overthrow even the most powerful empire. By the summer of 1905, the stage was fully set. The discontent that had simmered for decades, the faith in protective magic, and the leadership of visionaries like Kinjekitile Ngwale created a combustible mix. Across German East Africa, whispers turned into speeches, meetings into assemblies, and assemblies into plans for armed resistance. It was a time of tension, hope, and anticipation. Ordinary men and women, armed with farming tools, knives, and spears, were preparing to stand against rifles, cannons, and a disciplined European army. Their courage would be tested, their faith challenged, and their land soaked with the blood and determination of a people fighting for freedom. This was the world in which the Maji Maji Rebellion was born, a world of oppression, faith, and unyielding courage. In the chapters that follow, we will journey alongside these warriors, witness their battles, understand the devastation they endured, and honor the legacy they left for generations to come. In the heart of German East Africa, the year 1905 marked a turning point, not through guns or cannons, but through faith, courage, and vision. For decades, the people of this land had endured oppression under the German colonial machine. Yet, amid the suffering, a new force began to emerge, one born not from weapons, but from the spiritual traditions and beliefs that had sustained African societies for centuries. It began with Kinjekitile Ngwale, a man whose presence would forever change the course of history. Known to some as a prophet, to others as a spirit medium, Ngwale was a farmer from the Matumbi Hills who claimed to have been possessed by a spirit known as Hongo, the deity of vengeance and liberation. Through visions and rituals, Ngwale told the people that the time had. The heart of Ngwale's message was simple, yet powerful. If warriors anointed themselves with sacred water, Maji, they would be invincible against German bullets. This was no ordinary water. It was infused with spiritual power, a tangible expression of the belief that the divine could intervene in human affairs. For the people, it symbolized hope in the face of overwhelming odds, a shield against the technological superiority of their oppressors. But Maji alone was not enough. The rebellion drew strength from a remarkable coalition of tribes, who, under normal circumstances, might have remained separated by centuries of linguistic, cultural, and territorial differences. The Matumbi, Ngoni, Yao, Pagoro, Njindo, and other groups united under a shared vision: liberation from German tyranny. This unity was unprecedented. The German strategy relied heavily on divide and rule, exploiting tribal differences to maintain control. Yet, here, faith and a common struggle overcame centuries of division. Villagers from distant regions traveled for days to meet, discuss strategy, and participate in rituals. Kinjekitile's message spread like wildfire, carried by oral storytellers, elders, and messengers. As word of the rebellion grew, so too did the sense of purpose among ordinary people. Farmers who had never held a weapon felt empowered by spiritual conviction. Women, often overlooked in historical accounts, played crucial roles, preparing supplies, passing messages, and even participating in rituals. Children learned to support the cause, helping carry tools and food to the warriors who gathered in secret. The rituals themselves were elaborate and deeply symbolic. Warriors drank the sacred water, chanted invocations, and were marked with tribal symbols of protection and courage. Elders led dances that lasted late into the night, each movement representing defiance, resilience, and the anticipation of victory. Music, drums, and chants echoed through the hills, weaving a collective energy that bound communities together. The Germans, confident in their technological and military superiority, remained largely unaware of the scale of this spiritual movement. They saw the Matumbi Hills and surrounding regions as quiet, subservient, and controllable. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was gathering, a people unified by faith, shared suffering, and the vision of a life free from colonial oppression. Kinjekitile's charisma was key. His words inspired courage, his prophecies instilled hope, and his presence gave meaning to ordinary acts of defiance. Villagers believed that Hongo's spirit imbued them with strength, that Maji could not fail, and that even the most lethal European weapons would be powerless against divine protection. This faith, while mystical, had very real consequences. It gave people the courage to confront an enemy far more powerful, to march into battle knowing that survival was uncertain, yet the cause was righteous. Preparations for rebellion were meticulous. Villagers stockpiled weapons, though these were often farming tools repurposed as instruments of war: hoes, spears, machetes, and clubs. Secret caches of food were hidden in forests. Scouts patrolled for signs of German movement. Plans were shared in whispers, with villagers relying on intuition and knowledge of the terrain to gain an advantage. The scale of unity was extraordinary. At its peak, historians estimate that up to 20,000 warriors from diverse ethnic groups were involved. This coalition, bound by faith in Maji, defiance of oppression, and belief in a shared destiny, would become one of the largest uprisings in colonial African history. Yet, even as preparations reached their peak, there were voices of caution. Some elders doubted that spiritual protection alone could withstand modern rifles. Others feared the consequences of German retaliation, which, in earlier uprisings across Africa, had been merciless. But the conviction of the people and the magnetic leadership of Kinjekitile Ngwale outweighed caution. The rebellion was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable. And so, in the months leading up to the outbreak of war, Tanzania's landscape became a crucible for revolution. Forests, rivers, and hills served not only as home but as training grounds for the warriors. Every act, from the preparation of Maji to the secretive marches across villages, was a declaration: Africa would not submit quietly. By the end of this chapter in history, the stage was set. Across German East Africa, the people, armed with faith, courage, and unity, stood poised to challenge one of the most powerful colonial empires the world had ever seen. They would soon march into battle with a conviction that bullets could not touch them, a hope that Maji would shield their bodies, and a determination to reclaim their dignity, their land, and their freedom. By mid-1905, the simmering resentment of decades boiled over into open rebellion. The warriors of German East Africa, armed with farming tools, machetes, spears, and the unshakable belief in Maji, marched into battle against one of the most technologically advanced military forces in Africa at the time. The air was thick with tension, courage, and a sense of inevitability. At the heart of the uprising was the Matumbi Hills, where thousands of warriors had gathered under the guidance of Kinjekitile Ngwale. From this base, the rebellion would spread across regions, igniting villages from the Rufiji Valley to the southern highlands. It was a movement that transcended tribal divisions and relied on one of humanity's oldest forms of warfare: knowledge of the land, surprise, and sheer audacity. The first attacks were aimed at German outposts and supply lines, strategically chosen for both symbolic and tactical impact. Small, mobile groups of warriors descended upon remote garrisons, striking swiftly before vanishing into forests and hills. The Germans, confident in their superior weaponry, were caught off guard by the intensity and coordination of these attacks. The psychological power of Maji was evident on the battlefield. Warriors believed the sacred water had made them bulletproof, and this faith gave them an extraordinary fearlessness. Facing German rifles and artillery, they charged with unparalleled bravery, often chanting invocations and calling upon ancestral spirits for protection. To the Germans, it appeared as though these fighters were reckless or even invincible. Tactically, the rebellion relied heavily on guerrilla warfare. Knowledge of the terrain was paramount. Forests, rivers, and hills became natural defenses. Warriors used hit-and-run tactics, ambushing convoys, and retreating before German reinforcements could arrive. Villages were often abandoned to lure the enemy into traps. Though armed mostly with rudimentary weapons, the rebels' intimate familiarity with the land allowed them to outmaneuver a technologically superior force. The German response initially underestimated the rebellion. Commanders assumed that disorganized farmers could not pose a sustained threat. Early clashes reinforced this arrogance, as small victories by the rebels were often localized and seemingly sporadic. Yet, for the villagers, each skirmish was a declaration of autonomy. Even when a village was destroyed, the courage displayed in the attacks spread inspiration to neighboring regions. The scale of coordination across tribes was astonishing. Despite linguistic and cultural differences, warriors communicated through messengers, signals, and prearranged strategies. Rivers, hills, and forests became conduits of intelligence. Scouts moved silently across the land, reporting enemy positions and warning of impending attacks. In many cases, local knowledge allowed rebels to avoid capture, even when confronted by larger German forces. One of the most remarkable aspects of the outbreak was the symbolic power of victory and sacrifice. Every engagement, no matter how small, carried significance. Burning German outposts became icons of resistance. Ambushing a convoy was not just a military act but a statement of defiance, proof that colonial authority was not invincible. However, these early successes came at a cost. Casualties mounted, and German reprisals began. The rebels faced modern rifles, artillery, and brutal punishments for captured villages. Yet, the belief in Maji persisted, emboldening warriors to continue fighting against overwhelming odds. Their faith was more than spiritual. It was a psychological armor, giving them courage to confront an enemy whose technology dwarfed their own. The rebellion's momentum spread quickly. By late 1905, 10 different tribes had joined forces in what historians would later describe as one of the largest coordinated uprisings against colonial rule in Africa. Every tribe brought unique skills. The Ngoni were famed for their spear tactics. The Matumbi were expert forest fighters. The Yarrow contributed knowledge of local terrain and river systems. This diversity, united by a single cause, amplified the effectiveness of the rebellion. The Germans, now fully aware of the scale of the uprising, began to escalate their response. Reinforcements were called in from across the colony. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were subjected to collective punishment. Yet, the rebellion had already demonstrated that faith, unity, and knowledge of the land could temporarily neutralize technological advantage. Stories of heroism spread quickly. One account tells of a group of Matumbi warriors who, after drinking Maji, charged a German garrison with nothing but spears and machetes. Though many fell, their courage inspired neighboring villages to rise in solidarity. Another recounts Yarrow scouts intercepting German supply lines, disrupting communication, and providing critical intelligence to the larger coalition. These early victories, though symbolic and tactical, shook the foundations of German rule. The colonial authorities were forced to reconsider their strategy, realizing that suppression would not be simple. The rebellion had transcended a local dispute. It had become a continental example of resistance, demonstrating that spiritual conviction and collective unity could challenge even a formidable imperial power. Yet, it was clear that the rebellion had entered a dangerous phase. The Germans were learning, adapting, and preparing a more ruthless campaign. Villagers knew that the coming months would test their courage, their faith, and the very promise of Maji. The outbreak had begun, but the true story of heroism, tragedy, and resistance was only just starting to unfold. This was the moment when faith met fire, hope met steel, and the land of Tanzania became a battlefield for freedom. The Maji Maji Rebellion had emerged from whispers and rituals into open war, a testament to the resilience of human spirit and the extraordinary power of unity against oppression. The courage of the Maji Maji warriors had shaken the foundations of German East Africa, but the colonial powers were not accustomed to being challenged. By late 1905, the German authorities understood that they faced more than a simple local uprising. They faced a coordinated rebellion that had united tribes, defied their rule, and inspired hope in the hearts of the oppressed. The response was swift, calculated, and merciless. German commanders implemented a brutal counterinsurgency strategy designed to crush the rebellion entirely. It was a lesson in the devastating power of modern warfare applied against unarmed or lightly armed populations. The German strategy relied on three main tactics: overwhelming military force, scorched earth policies, and terror against civilian populations. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground. Crops were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and homes reduced to ash. Any villager who resisted, or was suspected of resisting, faced summary execution. The Germans hoped that starvation, fear, and destruction would break the will of the people faster than bullets alone. The use of modern rifles and artillery against warriors armed primarily with spears, machetes, and rudimentary tools created a horrific imbalance. Early engagements had shown the Germans that bravery alone could not defeat technology, and they responded with precision. Columns of well-trained soldiers moved systematically across the countryside, leaving devastation in their wake. One of the most devastating tactics was the scorched earth policy. Fields of cassava, millet, and maize, the primary sources of food for local communities, were burned or seized. Forests were cleared, and wells poisoned, leaving villagers with neither shelter nor sustenance. Famine soon spread across the region, compounding the horrors of war. Massacres became a tragic hallmark of the German response. Entire communities were slaughtered, often indiscriminately. Men, women, and children were executed or forced to flee, leaving behind a trail of death and suffering. Historians estimate that over 250,000 Africans perished, most not in battle, but from famine and the systematic destruction of villages. The psychological impact was profound. Survivors spoke of entire families wiped out, of the fear that haunted every step outside the forest, and of the devastation that would take decades to recover from. Yet, even in the face of such brutality, the spirit of resistance endured. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and courage spread quietly from village to village, carried by survivors and oral historians. The German forces also made strategic use of collaboration with compliant local chiefs who were loyal to colonial authority. These chiefs assisted in identifying rebel hideouts, enforcing labor quotas, and rounding up villagers suspected of supporting the rebellion. While many tribes had united against oppression, the Germans exploited divisions wherever possible, intensifying the brutality and further fracturing communities. Despite this overwhelming force, the Maji Maji warriors' belief in spiritual protection remained a powerful psychological weapon. Warriors continued to face German bullets with courage, bolstered by the sacred water and ancestral faith. However, the limits of Maji were brutally exposed when villages were destroyed, and comrades fell under rifle fire. Yet even in defeat, their bravery became a symbol of defiance that resonated far beyond their home villages. The destruction extended to entire regions. Some historians note that up to 15% of the population in affected areas perished due to famine and violence. The aftermath left the land scarred, forests cut down, fields empty, villages in ruins. Survivors faced not only physical hardship but also the trauma of witnessing loved ones killed, homes destroyed, and traditions disrupted. Yet, even as German forces seemed victorious, the rebellion had left an indelible mark on colonial consciousness. The sheer scale of coordination, the unity of diverse tribes, and the courage displayed shook German officials. They realized that control over the population was far from absolute, and that the rebellion had awakened a political consciousness that would not easily be suppressed. The brutality of the German response also exposed the limits of military power against the human spirit. While rifles could kill and fire could destroy, the ideals that had inspired the Maji Maji, faith, unity, and the desire for freedom, remained alive in the hearts of survivors. This enduring legacy would influence future generations of Africans seeking liberation from colonial rule. The Maji Maji Rebellion, though brutally suppressed, became a defining moment in African resistance against colonialism. It was a vivid demonstration that oppression could be challenged, that spiritual conviction could inspire courage, and that unity across tribal lines could form a formidable force, even against overwhelming odds. In retrospect, the German response highlights the dark consequences of colonial power, the willingness to inflict suffering on entire populations, the destruction of communities, and the reliance on fear to maintain control. Yet it also underscores the extraordinary bravery of the Maji Maji warriors, whose courage became a beacon of hope for future generations. The brutality was staggering, but the rebellion had already achieved a profound victory. It etched the story of resistance into the memory of a nation. Across Tanzania, in forests and villages, the tale of those who drank Maji and faced bullets with unyielding faith would be told for generations, inspiring future struggles for freedom and justice. By 1906, the Maji Maji Rebellion had reached a critical stage. The initial shock of the uprising had passed, and the German authorities had adapted their strategies. They had reinforced garrisons, mobilized additional troops, and refined their counterinsurgency tactics. Despite the courage of the warriors and the spiritual conviction that Maji would protect them, the rebellion began to encounter the harsh reality of modern warfare. The first major turning point came with the systematic encirclement of rebel strongholds. German forces, learning from earlier setbacks, moved decisively to cut off supply routes, isolate villages, and destroy the rebels' ability to coordinate. The forests and hills that had once offered protection now became traps. Communication lines faltered, and many warriors found themselves cut off from reinforcements and supplies. At the heart of the rebellion was Kinjekitile Ngwale, whose leadership had unified disparate tribes under a common cause. Ngwale's spiritual authority was unparalleled. He was both a prophet and a symbol of resistance. His capture would prove devastating to the morale and coordination of the rebels. In a calculated move, German forces tracked Ngwale to a remote village where he had sought refuge. According to oral histories, his presence inspired thousands, who believed that as long as he lived, their Maji would protect them. The Germans, understanding the symbolic power of their target, planned a precise operation to remove him from the battlefield. The capture of Ngwale in August 1906 marked the collapse of central leadership. He was imprisoned, interrogated, and ultimately executed, stripped of his power, yet immortalized as a martyr in the collective memory of the people. His death sent shockwaves across the rebellion. Without his guidance, coordination faltered, and the once unified tribes began to retreat into their respective regions. Even as the leadership collapsed, localized resistance continued. Smaller groups of warriors launched sporadic attacks, but these were often disorganized and vulnerable to the superior firepower of the German troops. Villages that had once been united were now fragmented, each struggling to survive in the face of relentless bombardment, famine, and disease. The turning point of the rebellion was not a single battle but a series of strategic defeats and psychological blows. The Germans, using terror and overwhelming force, crushed organized resistance, forcing survivors to scatter into the hills and forests. Communities that had fought side by side for freedom were broken apart, and the rebellion's momentum was lost. Despite these defeats, the rebellion's legacy of courage and defiance endured. Stories of warriors facing bullets with unyielding faith, of communities rising together against impossible odds, and of leaders like Ngwale sacrificing everything for their people will be passed down for generations. Oral traditions preserved the memory of those who had fought bravely, even in the face of overwhelming odds. By late 1907, the organized rebellion had been effectively crushed. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and thousands had perished. Yet the impact of the Maji Maji Rebellion extended far beyond the battlefield. It exposed the brutality of colonial rule, demonstrated the power of faith and unity, and inspired future generations to continue the struggle for freedom. The rebellion's final phase also highlighted the human cost of resistance. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, entire communities had been displaced, and the social fabric of the region had been irreparably damaged. Yet, the courage displayed in the face of such adversity became a powerful symbol, a reminder that oppression, no matter how severe, could not extinguish the desire for freedom. The courage of the Maji Maji warriors and the unity of the tribes came at a terrible price. By the time the rebellion was crushed, hundreds of thousands of Africans had perished, most not in battle, but from famine, disease, and the deliberate destruction of their homes and crops. The human cost of resistance was staggering, a vivid reminder of both the brutality of colonial rule and the extraordinary courage of those who dared to resist. The German scorched earth policy had left villages in ruins. Fields of maize, millet, and cassava, the staples of survival, had been burned or destroyed, leaving families without food. Livestock, essential for farming and sustenance, had been slaughtered or driven away. With homes and stores of food gone, starvation swept through communities like wildfire. Famine became one of the rebellion's deadliest consequences. Historians estimate that over 200,000 people died from starvation, a number far exceeding battlefield casualties. Children, often the most vulnerable, were especially affected. Entire generations faced malnutrition, disease, and the trauma of losing parents and siblings. Villages that had once thrived were reduced to ghost towns, their inhabitants scattered across forests and neighboring regions. Disease compounded the suffering. With families displaced and living in overcrowded conditions in makeshift shelters, illnesses spread rapidly. Malaria, dysentery, and other infectious diseases took countless lives, adding to the death toll already wrought by famine and warfare. Communities were decimated, and social structures that had sustained life for centuries were shattered. The psychological trauma of the rebellion was immense. Survivors recalled scenes of villages burned to the ground, family members executed or starving to death, and friends lost on the battlefield. Oral histories recount the horrors of mass executions, the desperation of fleeing villages, and the despair that came from watching crops and homes consumed by fire. Yet even in the face of such devastation, the spirit of the people endured. Survivors carried with them the stories of bravery, faith, and resistance. Songs and oral narratives about the rebellion, the warriors, and the sacred Maji kept the memory of courage alive. These stories served as a form of cultural preservation, ensuring that the sacrifices of the rebellion would not be forgotten. The destruction extended beyond lives and villages. It touched culture, traditions, and social cohesion. Many communities lost elders, storytellers, and spiritual leaders, creating a gap in the transmission of knowledge and traditions. Rituals, festivals, and daily practices were disrupted, and some were never fully restored. The rebellion's suppression was not only a physical defeat but a cultural trauma that would echo for decades. Despite these immense losses, the rebellion left a lasting legacy of resilience. Communities that survived began the arduous task of rebuilding. Fields were replanted, homes reconstructed, and social bonds gradually restored. The memory of the rebellion, its courage, faith, and unity, became a source of identity and pride. For future generations, the Maji Maji Rebellion symbolized the power of collective action and the human desire for freedom. The human cost also highlighted the limits of colonial power. While the Germans could destroy villages and fields, they could not erase the stories of bravery, unity, and defiance. Survivors carried these memories into the future, ensuring that the rebellion would inspire later movements for freedom and self-determination across East Africa. One of the most poignant aspects of the Maji Maji Rebellion was the intergenerational impact. Children who survived famine and violence grew up hearing tales of sacrifice, valor, and the mystical protection of Maji. These narratives shaped the cultural consciousness of Tanzanian communities, embedding a deep sense of pride, identity, and resistance that would inform the struggle for independence decades later. Even historians acknowledge the paradox of the rebellion. While militarily crushed, it succeeded morally and culturally. The sheer scale of participation, the unity of diverse tribes, and the courage displayed in the face of technological and military superiority left an indelible mark on African history. The Maji Maji Rebellion became a symbol of resistance against oppression, proving that the human spirit could endure even the harshest devastation. In the aftermath, communities began to honor the dead through ceremonies, songs, and storytelling. This cultural remembrance preserved not only the memory of the rebellion but also the lessons it carried: unity, courage, faith, and the unbreakable will of a people to fight for freedom. The Maji Maji Rebellion, in its human cost and devastation, stands as a testament to both the horrors of colonialism and the extraordinary resilience of African communities. It reminds us that the price of freedom is often immense, yet the legacy of courage, faith, and unity transcends death, famine, and destruction. Though the Maji Maji Rebellion was ultimately suppressed by German forces, its impact on Tanzania, East Africa, and the continent as a whole was profound. The rebellion left behind not only stories of bravery and sacrifice but also a lasting legacy that would shape the cultural, political, and social consciousness of the people. The most immediate legacy was the memory of resistance. Survivors carried the stories of warriors who drank sacred moji and faced German bullets with unflinching courage. These tales, passed orally from elders to children, became foundational narratives of defiance, inspiring future generations to challenge oppression. The rebellion also left an indelible mark on Tanzanian identity. Across the regions affected by the uprising, people came to recognize that despite ethnic, linguistic, and tribal differences, they could unite for a common cause. This sense of unity would later serve as a foundation for the nationalist movements of the 20th century, which sought to end colonial rule and forge a modern Tanzanian state. The cultural legacy of the rebellion is equally significant. The rituals, songs, and chants of the Maji Maji warriors were preserved in local traditions. Even after the destruction of villages and the loss of elders, communities adapted, keeping alive the spiritual practices and oral histories that had fueled the rebellion. Sacred water, Maji, though no longer a weapon, remained a symbol of courage, unity, and divine protection. Historians recognize the Maji Maji Rebellion as one of the earliest large-scale uprisings against colonialism in Africa. Its lessons reverberated throughout the continent, demonstrating that organized resistance, even against technologically superior forces, could instill fear, force strategic reconsideration, and challenge the legitimacy of colonial rule. Politically, the rebellion exposed the limits of colonial authority. While the Germans temporarily reasserted control through terror, they were unable to erase the memory of resistance. Reports from German officials at the time reveal their astonishment at the scale, coordination, and bravery of the rebellion. Even after the uprising was crushed, the fear of future insurrections lingered in the colonial administration, influencing policy and military strategy in the years that followed. The rebellion also emphasized the power of faith and belief in mobilizing communities. The story of Maji, sacred water believed to make warriors bulletproof, may seem mystical to outsiders, yet it demonstrates how cultural and spiritual frameworks can inspire extraordinary courage and unity. Anthropologists and historians note that the psychological impact of Maji gave the warriors confidence that no ordinary weapon could match, illustrating the profound role of belief in human resilience. Beyond historical and cultural significance, the rebellion had a lasting social impact. Survivors rebuilt villages and communities, often carrying with them a renewed commitment to unity and collective action. These experiences reinforced social bonds and laid the groundwork for future cooperative endeavors, including movements for education, health, and political representation under colonial rule. The Maji Maji Rebellion also became a symbol of moral courage. Though militarily defeated, the uprising represented a triumph of spirit over oppression, of hope over fear. The people had stood up against a powerful colonial empire, and even in defeat, their story became a beacon of resistance. Monuments, memorials, and ceremonies today continue to honor their bravery and preserve the lessons for future generations. In the broader context of African history, the Maji Maji Rebellion served as a template for resistance movements across the continent. Leaders and activists studying the uprising learned that unity across tribal lines, community mobilization, and moral conviction could challenge colonial powers. The rebellion became a reference point for anti-colonial movements throughout East and Southern Africa during the 20th century. Even today, the story of Maji Maji resonates. Schools, museums, and cultural organizations in Tanzania and beyond teach children about the bravery of the warriors, the leadership of Kinjekitile Ngwale, and the sacrifices made by ordinary men, women, and children. The rebellion's lessons, faith, unity, courage, and resilience, remain relevant in struggles for social justice and human dignity worldwide. Finally, the Maji Maji Rebellion reminds us that history is not only measured by victories and defeats but by the courage to resist injustice. The people of German East Africa, armed with faith, determination, and the desire for freedom, challenged an empire. They faced bullets, famine, and death, yet their legacy endures, a story passed down, remembered, and honored across generations. The rebellion teaches that even in the darkest times, courage and unity can illuminate a path toward freedom and dignity. It is a story of human spirit, resilience, and the power of belief, one that continues to inspire, educate, and remind us of the profound strength found in collective action and unwavering faith.